The ashes of World War II were still settling in 1955, but the world was already embroiled in a new conflict, the Cold War. This was not a war fought with traditional weapons, but a war of ideologies, a war of influence, and a war of nerves. This global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers that emerged from the war, was a battle for ideological dominance, geopolitical influence, and ultimately the future of the international order. Each side sought to spread its own political and economic system across the globe, leading to a tense and often dangerous rivalry. The devastation of World War II left Europe shattered, both physically and politically. Cities lay in ruins, economies were in tatters, and millions of people were displaced. The continent was a blank slate upon which the superpowers would project their visions for the future. Germany, once a major power, was divided and occupied. The capital city of Berlin became the most visible symbol of this division, with the Berlin Wall eventually becoming the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. The United States and its allies controlled West Germany, while the Soviet Union held sway over East Germany. This division was not just a matter of territory, but of ideology, with each side seeking to prove the superiority of its system. This division of Europe mirrored the broader ideological divide of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill, represented the stark contrast between the democratic West and the communist East. The United States, promoting democracy and capitalism, stood in stark contrast to the Soviet Union, which championed communism and a centrally planned economy. Each side believed that their system was the key to a better future for humanity. The fault line between these two superpowers ran through the heart of Europe, turning the continent into a chessboard for their rivalry. Every move made by one side was countered by the other, in a high-stakes game that had the potential to escalate into full-scale war. Both sides feared the other's intentions and sought to expand their spheres of influence. This led to a series of alliances and counter-alliances as each side tried to build a coalition of supportive nations. The Soviet Union, led by the enigmatic Joseph Stalin, had emerged from the war victorious but deeply suspicious of the West. Stalin's experiences during the war had left him convinced that the Western allies could not be trusted. Stalin, having borne the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, believed that the Western allies had delayed the opening of a second front in Europe to weaken the Soviet Union. This belief fueled his desire to secure the Soviet Union's western borders. This deep-seated mistrust, coupled with Stalin's desire to create a buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe, set the stage for the formation of the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was not just a military alliance, but a tool for the Soviet Union to maintain control over its Eastern European neighbours. The stage was set for a new kind of conflict, one characterized by proxy wars, espionage, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War would dominate global politics for the next several decades, shaping the world in ways that are still felt today. The Cold War cast a long shadow over Europe, influencing every aspect of life on the continent for decades. The continent was divided by the metaphorical Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill to describe the ideological and physical barrier that separated Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe from the West. This division was not just a line on a map, but a profound separation of political, economic and social systems. In the East, the Soviet Union imposed its will on its satellite states, suppressing dissent and imposing communist regimes. The presence of Soviet tanks and soldiers in the streets was a constant reminder of the iron grip the USSR held over these nations. The West, led by the United States, sought to contain the spread of communism and promote democracy and capitalism. American soldiers were stationed across Western Europe, and US political leaders frequently met to strategize on how to counter Soviet influence. This ideological struggle played out in various ways, from propaganda campaigns to espionage activities. Both sides engaged in a relentless battle for hearts and minds, each trying to outdo the other in a bid to prove the superiority of their system. The Marshall Plan, a massive US aid program, helped rebuild war-torn Western Europe and bolster its economies against the allure of communism. This economic assistance was crucial in stabilizing the region, and ensuring that Western European countries remained aligned with the US. The Soviet Union, in turn, tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, crushing uprisings in Hungary and East Germany. These brutal crackdowns were meant to send a clear message. Any attempt to break free from Soviet control would be met with overwhelming force. The fear of Soviet expansionism was palpable in the West. Military drills were conducted regularly, and anti-Soviet protests were a common sight. Western European leaders were in constant discussions about defense strategies to protect their nations from a potential Soviet invasion. The Red Army, battle-hardened from World War II, was stationed throughout Eastern Europe, casting a menacing shadow over Western Europe. The sight of Soviet military parades and the presence of Red Army soldiers served as a constant reminder of the threat posed by the USSR. The threat of a Soviet invasion, whether real or perceived, loomed large in the minds of Western leaders. This fear drove the construction of military fortifications and the development of extensive defense plans. This fear was further exacerbated by the Berlin Blockade of 1948-49, during which the Soviet Union attempted to starve West Berlin into submission by cutting off all land access to the city. The blockade was a direct challenge to the West and a test of its resolve. The successful Allied airlift to supply West Berlin demonstrated Western resolve, but also highlighted the precariousness of the situation in Europe. The airlift was a massive logistical effort that involved thousands of flights and the delivery of essential supplies to the beleaguered city. In this atmosphere of suspicion, fear, and ideological rivalry, the formation of NATO in 1949 marked a turning point in the Cold War. The alliance was a clear signal that the West was united in its determination to resist Soviet aggression and protect its members from any potential threats. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, founded in 1949, was a direct response to the growing Soviet threat in Europe. This military alliance, comprised of the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations, was founded on the principle of collective defense. An attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. NATO's formation was a clear signal to the Soviet Union that the West was united in its determination to resist further Soviet expansion. The United States, with its overwhelming economic and military might, played a pivotal role in NATO. The presence of American troops in Europe, along with the American nuclear umbrella, provided a crucial deterrent against Soviet aggression. NATO's military strength, combined with its political unity, helped stabilize Western Europe and deter a Soviet invasion. However, the formation of NATO also had the unintended consequence of escalating tensions with the Soviet Union. Stalin viewed NATO as an aggressive alliance aimed at encircling and containing the Soviet Union. The creation of NATO deepened the Cold War divide, solidifying the two opposing blocs in Europe. The Soviet Union, feeling increasingly threatened by NATO's military build-up, responded in kind, creating its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955. The stage was now set for a dangerous arms race and a decades-long standoff between East and West. The formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955 was a direct response to the perceived threat posed by NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, had been established in 1949, and its primary purpose was to counter Soviet influence in Europe. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, viewed NATO's expansion and military build-up as a direct threat to its security. The presence of NATO forces in Western Europe was seen as a clear and present danger to the Soviet sphere of influence, and a challenge to its dominance in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union was determined to maintain its control over the Eastern Bloc countries, which it considered vital to its strategic interests. The Warsaw Pact, officially known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance, was ostensibly a defensive alliance, created to protect its members from Western aggression. However, its true purpose went beyond mere defense, created to protect its members from Western aggression. The Soviet Union used the pact to justify its military presence in Eastern Europe. However, the Warsaw Pact was more than just a military alliance. It was a political tool, a means for the Soviet Union to exert control over its allies. It was also a tool of Soviet control, a way to legitimize the presence of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe and to maintain Moscow's grip on its satellite states. The Soviet Union used the pact to ensure that its allies remained loyal and obedient, and to maintain Moscow's grip on its satellite states. The pact's founding treaty included provisions for cooperation and mutual assistance. The pact's founding treaty included provisions for cooperation and mutual assistance, which the Soviet Union used to justify its interventions in Hungary in 1956, and Czechoslovakia in 1968. These interventions were aimed at crushing uprisings and maintaining Soviet control, and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Soviet Union was determined to prevent any challenges to its authority within the Eastern Bloc. The Warsaw Pact, therefore, served a dual purpose, deterring Western aggression and suppressing internal dissent within the Soviet bloc. It was a key instrument of Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War, and suppressing internal dissent within the Soviet bloc. The formation of the Warsaw Pact marked a significant escalation in the Cold War. The formation of the Warsaw Pact marked a significant escalation in the Cold War. It formalized the division of Europe into two opposing military blocs. It formalized the division of Europe into two opposing military blocs, each with its own nuclear arsenal, and heightened the risk of a direct military confrontation between the superpowers. Each with its own nuclear arsenal, and heightened the risk of a direct military confrontation between the superpowers. The world watched with bated breath as the two superpowers stared each other down, and heightened the risk of a direct military confrontation between the superpowers. The world watched with bated breath as the two superpowers stared each other down, each side armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over. The world watched with bated breath as the two superpowers stared each other down, each side armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over. The Cold War was a period of intense rivalry and tension, with the threat of nuclear war looming over the world, each side armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over. The Cold War was a period of intense rivalry and tension, with the threat of nuclear war looming over the world. The formation of the Warsaw Pact was a key moment in this dangerous and uncertain era.